Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking to Commissioner Summer Mersinger. Summer is a commissioner at the CFTC, and we're talking about what is that organization, what's its role, and what are some of the key challenges it sees in regulating the commodity markets in a period of energy transition and rapid market development. As always, you can support the show by please leaving a review on the platform you're listening on, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Summer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so we're talking about the CFTC, the Commodity Trading Futures Commission, its remit, and also what are the key challenges or questions that it's confronting right now. Before we go too far, for the benefit of our global audience, can you just explain what the CFTC is and its remit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have to start with a standard disclaimer that the views I express are my own and they do not reflect the reviews of the Commission and my fellow commissioners. With that, just kind of a little background on the CFTC, which is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. We oversee the derivatives markets. So we're really looking at the futures markets and how those markets are functioning, what they're meant to do, offer price discovery and hedging functions. Where the agency started was actually in agriculture commodities. So originally we were a division under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. As the agency grew, it made sense to kind of spin it out of USDA, but that's kind of our background. So we do talk a lot about agricultural commodities and the commodities futures on agricultural products, although it is a very small percentage of the markets we oversee at this point. And as the market regulator, we are really working with the exchanges, the market participants, the end users to make sure that the markets are running smoothly, that there's significant capital to ensure that they are safe, that they're liquid, and to kind of protect the overall system.
There's a lot in there. What is by being an independent government agency, what does that actually mean, and where does enforcement sit?
Yep, absolutely. So we actually, if you're looking at a government, if you were to look at kind of how does this all fall, we do report to the president. So it's not a, agency under any of the other departments. So we're led by a 5-person commission, and it's a bipartisan commission with at least 3 of the commissioners have to be the party of the president. As commissioners, we're nominated by the president and we're confirmed by the Senate. Our oversight committee in Congress is the House and Senate Agriculture Committees, which is very unusual for a financial regulator. We do have an enforcement division. It's a civil enforcement, so we're not enforcing any criminal penalties here or criminal statute. It's all civil. They're within our agency as well. And so while we have this regulatory piece and rulemaking piece, we also have enforcement. And so a lot of times we'll working with maybe the Department of Justice, with the SEC, maybe with the state's attorney general, bringing other, they may be bringing the criminal charges, but it's a pretty robust enforcement program.
And the fines, are just staying on that a moment, because obviously the fines are quite fantastic in terms of scale.
Yeah.
And, there was recently a payout to a whistleblower under the whistleblower scheme of some 200 million or so. I mean, an incredible amount. And interestingly, from the commodity trading community, I think they feel, or the general sentiment would be one of that the CFTC is very active compared to oversight over other industries, and actually, has a very consequential role to play, and has certainly has teeth.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you look at some of our more recent settlements, the whistleblower claims that come with it, it is we have a very active enforcement division. It's the largest division at our agency, actually. I would say, it probably a third of our staff are in the enforcement division. So the idea is these markets work when people, follow the rules and know that if you don't follow the rules that someone's going to catch you, and so it's a little bit of deterrence and hoping that people are seeing that we're watching and that, if we see something, we are going to catch it and we are going to bring a case. We have a very active whistleblower program for the same reason. So we get a lot of kind of insiders who see something and bring that to our attention through our whistleblower office. And I would say right now, for personally as a commissioner, I think almost 90% of my work is really reviewing enforcement matters. So we are a strong market enforcement agency
Mm.
in addition to, being a regulator.
How do you, obviously the commodity markets are very much global, and some prices are set outside the United States, outside of those exchanges, the CME or whatever it might be. How do what are your equivalent agencies in the other commodity trading hubs, and what is the interaction between those agencies?
Yeah, we work very closely with our international counterparts. So whether it's the FCA in the UK, ESMA in the EU, we just did in our open meeting last month, we just did a capital comparability determination proposal with the Japanese security clearance. So we have to be in constant contact with our kind of sister agencies in other countries, but we figure out, okay, who's the equivalent regulator in this country, and a lot of times we have MOUs with other country regulators. We work with some international bodies that kind of try to look at these markets more globally. A lot of times on the enforcement side, if we have to get information or subpoena someone or get bank records in another country, we can use our MOUs to cooperate with their kind of enforcement divisions to help us get the information we need to bring our case. So we have a very robust international cooperation with counterparts, and again, that's another unique thing about our agency. When you think about financial regulators, a lot of our financial regulators are really just looking at the U.S. financial
One of
system.
so one of the things that strikes me about the commodities sector in general is that the last 20 years has been characterized by rapidly evolving markets, rapidly evolving opportunities, and led by private companies. Right? We think about the power markets and the gas markets, and one of the things that you mentioned the last time we met, obviously regulators by their nature are backward looking. How does that circle get squared in terms of, for lots of the trades that were developed at, God forbid I mention Enron, but, some of this stuff just didn't have clear regulatory guidance attached to it at the time. How does that work? I mean, and that's going to be relevant right now as we talk later on about cryptocurrencies and where they sit. But how does that work?
Yeah, it is tough because regulators are always looking at the previous crisis and trying to figure out how to prevent that from happening. And, it could be things evolve so quickly that, what you were looking at from before, it doesn't even exist anymore. Everybody's moving in a different direction. So sometimes you have to take a step back and look at, okay, here are the regulations, and the CFTC, because we are a market regulator, our regulations are more, we call it principle based, where we don't have prescriptive rules for how things have to work. That gives us a lot of flexibility when we're looking at something new and changing. Okay, what is it we're looking at? How does this principle apply here? So I think some of it is having that flexibility. So some of it is having some regulatory flexibility, or at least rules that give some flexibility to the markets and to the space to evolve, become more efficient, become more effective. And I think the other thing that we have to do is, yeah, we need to learn the lessons of the past and we need to see what worked and what didn't, but we can't stop looking ahead. We can't stop learning about new markets, about what's going on. One thing we do that's unique at the CFTC, at least the way we approach our advisory committees is unique. So a lot of government agencies have these advisory committees, and they're really just industry stakeholders that help advise policy. And I think some of the other agencies, it's more of a just kind of a ceremonial type thing where we actually are very intentional with our advisory committees. A lot of our rulemaking actually comes out of suggestions that come from our advisory committees. And so it really is stakeholders helping us write the rules of the road or look down the road and see what regulations might need to change or need to be put in place. And that helps us stay ahead, and look down the road a little bit. But we also need to be talking to stakeholders and those in the market saying, okay, what's going on now and what's going to be coming up and what should we be thinking about or looking for. And so I think that's really the way we try to, as you said, kind of complete that circle is, just really work hand in hand with people who are working in these markets day in and day out, and
Mm.
not kind of become too insulated. People in DC always joke about the inside the beltway mentality where you only know what's going on in this little, our little world in Washington, and you don't know how things are impacting people in the real world, where our agency is very deliberate in going out and saying, okay, how is this impacting you? What do you recommend? How can we do better? And how do we make sure our markets are strong and resilient, moving forward?
Mm. And how do you, just as a public service announcement, how do you get on those advisory boards?
So that's a good question. Like everything in the government, it is a process. As a commissioner, we get to sponsor one of the 5 advisory committees. So at the CFTC, we have a agriculture advisory committee, we have a global markets advisory committee, a market risk committee, a technology committee, and an energy and environments committee. And the membership, we put out a solicitation in the Federal Register. And usually there's a certain, usually there's a 30-day period for people to apply. And I know we just finished this so I have the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. So I have kind of a core committee, but I also have an associate committee. And we're just finishing that process where we published it in the Federal Register, asked people to apply, they can be nominated, they can nominate themselves, send in their information. And then we go through and look at, who's applied, what their background is. And then we have to balance views. So you can't just have a one-sided advisory committee. You have to have multiple views kind of across industry. Each of these committees have different terms. It might be a 3-year term. It might be a 1-year term. You can also go on the CFTC's website and go to advisory committees, and it shows you all the advisory committees and which ones are currently looking for members. It's a little bit up to the sponsor within certain parameters of balancing views.
And silly question, are you on the board as an advisor, so as an individual?
You're representing your company, and that's kind of how we look at it for balancing. They're really providing insight and advice based on their industry and their company and their
Yeah.
background. And we also have like interest groups. We have usually, some public interest groups. We have academics. So you can also have other government agency experts on the advisory committee as well.
Perfect. Okay, so and that does, raise an interesting question. I guess we can wrap up with our next segment about where the remit lies, and so we talked about sort of what are sort of 3 things that are facing the CFTC today. we've covered on a previous episode we've done together in a panel the challenges around margin calls and liquidity and so forth. So the first one that you actually raised was, and then this ties in with what the SEC's proposed rulings about disclosures on this subject, is energy transition, and something that this phrase
Yes.
transition risk, which is quite a nebulous one, and it ties in where the SEC comes in, where the FERC comes in, and where what the CFTC's role is in all this. But what do you mean by transition risk, and how is the CFTC thinking about this in the context of stable markets?
Right. I think where where I look at transition risk is kind of in the broader discussion of financial risk due to climate change. So we've had a lot of focus on that in the last few years of what will climate change mean financially for industry, for the financial sector. And while I think that's an important focus, I think sometimes people get too far ahead and they forget that there's going to be some financial concerns in that transition period. So going from fossil fuel reliance to renewable is not an overnight thing. It's going to take time, and it's going to cost money as well. And so this idea that there's going to be some risk to the financial system in trying to make that move. And what's interesting with our markets is, we have a number of traditional energy futures markets. Got the oil contracts, we have natural gas contracts. We kind of have some of those traditional physical commodity in the energy space. But we also have some of the new contracts, some of the voluntary carbon contracts, and a number of kind of environmental indexes. So we're kind of in this interesting spot where we can see both markets and how they're reacting. And for me, when I look at our futures markets, I think they're going to be important tools for industry during this time of transition. So being able to try to hedge some of the risk of supply and cost, it's going to be important. And so we want to make sure that these futures markets are liquid, that they are available, that companies can use them to hedge. But at the same time, our markets are sensitive to kind of on the ground everyday occurrences. So our futures markets are very sensitive to the physical spot market. And what happens in the physical spot market is also of interest to us. And so one of the things that we're probably going to look at with my advisory committee is, as we are trying to move towards more renewable energy, we're seeing less and less investment in some of the traditional energy infrastructure. And as that investment, goes away or starts to shrink, that gets more and more difficult to, one, access the needed physical supply, and just continues to increase that cost. So, what is that going to do to the futures markets moving forward as we have these kind of disruptions on the physical supply side due to lack of investment in infrastructure? It is just this period of time where, it's going to be tricky moving from fossil fuels to renewables. And there's a lot of financial risk in that period of time that I think gets overlooked occasionally.
So yeah, it's fascinating. As markets shrink, they degrade and they become more volatile, right? We've said that quite a few times on this show. So what are the tools available for you to remedy that? And where does it fit within, if it does indeed fit with the CFTC's remit, to be able to say, look, obviously you can increase margin requirements and so forth, but it also seems that in that transition, new markets need to be changed and managed as well. I'm thinking like, okay, power markets, for example, as the world becomes more localized, more distributed generation, that's going to change the nature of how these grids operate as well. I mean, how sort of far along is the thinking on what this transition risk represents to all of the commodity markets?
Right. And I think part of the concern is I don't know how far, I don't think it's very far along. I think we need to be further along in trying to understand this. You know, are there things that we can do as a regulator or, our markets can do to ensure that there's adequate liquidity, ensure that people have a reason to participate? We've talked, like you said, we've talked about margin. Does margin become, as these become more and more volatile, does margin become a problematic for people who are trying to, hedge their price in a market that's moving constantly and rapidly? So I think right now we're really in the kind of fact-finding stage of what do we need to be looking at, what problems are coming, and what would be some potential solutions. And it is a little bit different in the futures market because, we can't just say like, well, our solution is we should go build more pipeline. That's not our role. We're not that regulator. We don't, approve pipeline permits. It might just be something where, it might be a change in the way a contract is settled. There might be something more substantive we can do on the rulemaking side. But right now we just need to be thinking about it, looking at it, and talking about it. And I think that's kind of the place we're in right now is really just a fact-finding stage.
It's almost upon us already, though, right? I think,
Yeah.
We're already looking at highly volatile markets just as a consequence of 3 years worth of, let's say a decade's worth of underinvestment in hydrocarbons. And already we're seeing, the dramatic consequences in Europe of the sanctions on Russia and the immediate tide to food prices. We've had a couple of episodes on this recently with Doomberg. Energy security, energy inflation is already sort of prevalent but is there, I don't know how much you can talk to this, but is there, do you think at the political level, a recognition that energy transition, has these negative consequences as well as we go through it?
I think you're starting to see more recognition. Certainly some of the kind of geopolitical circumstances has highlighted that and really brought attention to it, where I do think there was almost it was easy for politically to say, we need to move away from fossil fuels and move towards this cleaner energy, and everybody, should be headed in this direction. That was a very easy kind of political place to be, but the current situation highlights the fact that it's not that easy, and we aren't there, and we can't just make this transition. And so I think people are starting to realize that we've got to figure out a more practical way to do this. It's going to require us to rely on a lot of these traditional energy sources that we have in the past, and that, some of this is going to take, can we have a cleaner way of gathering this, producing this energy? Can we find locations around the world where they're going to do it, with better technology and more environmentally friendly and in less kind of political turbulent areas? So I do think current times have definitely kind of got people realizing that we do have to really focus on this now.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas, and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
So there's a lot of narrative out there, and it makes sense to me that if we can give carbon a price, that removes some of the uncertainty around investing in much needed hydrocarbons on this transition journey. To date, the US, at the federal level hasn't taken this on. We're seeing obviously there's obviously demand out there. You can see that in the uptake of voluntary credits. Where does the CFT, is that on the agenda? Is the CFTC looking at voluntary credits? Where does that sit?
At the currently, what we look at is the futures contracts on some of those carbon credits, and there are a number of them. So how are these markets working, and whether or not there's concerns with fraud and manipulation in the spot market as it relates to our futures market. I do think there's some interest, and I've talked to folks on the Hill about this, of, okay, part of a voluntary carbon market is only going to work if there's some sort of consistent validity to these contracts. Who's going to come in and say, like, yes, this is an adequate measurement of the carbon that either you're reducing or you're emitting, and that over its life cycle it's going to produce this much carbon or absorb this much carbon. There's really not, there are some kind of standard setting bodies that have popped up, but I think a lot of individuals want to see maybe a government validator of sorts, or a government agency overseeing the validators. And so I know there's some interest there, and look at the CFTC as a potential agency to do that. But it's tough because there's just so many questions around carbon capture, and how you're going to ensure that that the same person isn't getting credit for the same project, and it would be a big undertaking. And so I'm kind of in the, let's see how this goes. Let's see how private industry does with it. I like market-based solutions over government solutions, but there is definitely this question and interest in, would the CFTC be the right place to kind of oversee some of the carbon spot markets, specifically around kind of validating these credits.
Yeah, I can hear certain people screaming at the speakers right now,
Yeah.
saying "keep out."
Yeah, exactly.
But okay, so transition risk, I think, is one that is going to play out more and more, as especially with the SEC filing requirements coming online, and obviously this degradation of markets through lack of investment is going to create incredible volatility, which is going to cause a fair few headaches, I imagine, for companies and the CFTC alike. The other one, and tied to this that you've highlighted, is that a lot of around critical metals, and a lot of energy transition is reliant, especially the electrification of everything, is reliant on rare critical metals that, for the most part, at release right now, are mined and processed in China. Most of these are not traded markets. There are the emergence of longer term contracts, supply contracts, and some spot trading going on, minuscule amount in lithium and a few others. But you've highlighted that as an area of where the CFTC are looking at and thinking on. Can you just talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think the metals markets have been kind of maybe a footnote a little bit in the CFTC's jurisdiction, or just, kind of the futures markets more generally. But I think they're going to take a center stage here. How are you going to get adequate price discovery? I think having robust futures contracts on these metals would be a really useful tool for industry, and just generally, so that there's some transparency. And we're seeing some of the data, and we've got some sort of regulatory oversight on it. So I think there's certainly a role to play, and I think we'll see these markets become just kind of have a bigger role. But there are some of these metals that are necessary that, we might not have contracts on. I hear people talk about the fact that, the supply just isn't there. The length of time, if you are going to mine for these metals, the length of time that it takes to get that online and get it into the supply chain. The supply side of this is really tricky, and just trying to understand, okay, where could we have robust futures markets on these metals? And given the importance of them, from everything from an electric vehicle to a windmill, it's all of the renewable energy relies heavily on these metals. And so I think they're going to become really important markets. And so again, it's kind of fact finding, trying to figure out, what do we need to know, what do we need to look at, what's going on now, what might go on.
Oh, and a lot of this is also chemistries. A lot of it as well is in such tiny quantities that it could be very highly volatile, markets attached. But again, as you say, is there an advisory board set up for this? I mean,
No,
where does this?
that's what's interesting. There's not. And so I'm kind of taking it upon myself, as having the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, to add metals to that, because I think it easily falls in under both environment and energy. And, where it really, I don't think people were talking about, nobody was really talking about this when you talked about energy production and energy usage over the last, 20 years. Suddenly this is an important piece to the puzzle. So I'm kind of taking that under my advisory committee because of its importance, to
Yeah.
the two topics.
And because it does, I mean, we've had some guests on this podcast that I think would contribute well to that advisory committee. I mean, it does seem this is gaining, at least at the political level, an understanding of its crucialness in terms of security of supply, and that the US and Europe in particular are quite far behind, and we aren't going to meet our energy transition goals without securing supplies of these metals and securing them from either domestically, which has its own challenges we're seeing going on in Colorado and Utah, where there's been big societal pushback against mining of these rare earths, but also from, dare I say it, countries that are more allied to our interests than perhaps China has demonstrated. So okay, so the final one that just time is marching on, which is fascinating, is obviously cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, and just this explosion of not only just different currencies and so forth, but also use cases, and almost exchanges started to be talked about that are powered by blockchain, utilizing that power of transparency and fidelity that it has, and also tied to, in particular when it comes to commodities, being able to solve for some of the challenges that the current exchanges have, which is, we're not talking about provenance and so forth, and sustainability attributes, which blockchain technologies could easily incorporate and make efficient to trace and track. And we're starting to see that, with some of the miners and so on. But of course, this is such a new technology that we're still at a debate whether it's a security or a commodity, right? I
Yeah.
think it's the
Yeah,
current
no,
state.
it's tricky. It's funny, if you kind of talk about the top three issues faced by the CFTC. CFTC, I think some days it's crypto, crypto, and crypto, because it seems to be what sucking the oxygen out of the room. And it's a legally fascinating space, because you could put almost anything, any financial instrument, really anything, and make it a digital asset and put it on the blockchain. So I often get questioned, like, well, can you guys just make a list everything that's a commodity? The SEC will list everything that's a security, and then you guys can go upon your way and regulate. It's not that easy. Might not be either one, or it could change. The underlying assets or algorithm or whatever can change, and it could move between a commodity or a security. And so it is very tricky to say, okay, who's regulating this space? I would say in the United States right now, just basic purchasing and selling cryptocurrency. There's not somebody who is overseeing those entities that are the exchanges and markets for these assets. They do not have a specific regulator. Some of them are registered in states. I know New York has done a good job of trying to come up with kind of some state law, Wyoming as well. So there are some states that have built systems to try to regulate these markets, and they can register within the state. But as far as if someone thinks that there's a federal regulator looking over these markets day in and day out, there's just not.
So
And
that's
that's a
fascinating.
concern.
Yeah. So just to understand that, right? So at the moment, if we're looking at, say, I don't know, Coinbase, right? Or no one is sitting there. There's no the SEC nor the CFTC has eyes on that to work out whether there is that is a functioning exchange when it comes to trading Bitcoin, for example.
For the CFTC, we are kind of limited in our ability to go after fraud and manipulation in those spot markets where we have an existing futures contract. So, there are futures on Bitcoin. So if there's fraud and manipulation in Bitcoin, we can go, we can use our enforcement authority there. But we can't go in and do any sort of examination of these or audits of these companies because we don't have that regulatory oversight.
Because
So,
they're in the Philippines or something like that.
right, exactly. And so I think, there are efforts, there are a lot of efforts and we've seen a lot of legislation coming from the Hill that's trying to make this, set up a system where companies can go in and they can become a registered entity. So we have that kind of insight into the markets, and then we become their regulators. And then there's some federal preemption that goes, there's some kind of carrots for the industry to do this, right? Like they don't have to have a money transmitter license in every state, if they get registered with a federal agency and there's federal preemption. So there's certainly some advantages for these companies to do this. What's tricky is when you get back down to the actual product, even if you are a registered CFTC exchange, but you have a security, you know, the SEC has that jurisdiction. And so, we do share jurisdiction in some spaces, but I think everybody is saying, wait, I don't, I'm going to go to this regulator, register, go through their whole process, and then have the SEC come in and say, wait, what you're doing is illegal because you've got a security and you're not registered with the SEC. So that's where a lot of the ambiguity or that's kind of the rub here, is that right now, the way the law stands is if the SEC determines something as a security, then we don't have any jurisdiction.
It's over to them. And as we know, Mr. Gensler is obviously very interested in this subject,
Yes.
given his lectures at MIT and so forth. So it's eyes on from them. It's also analogous in some ways to the carbon markets as well, right? Where there's a greater desire to avoid these things being calculated as royalties and then therefore securities, right? And I think the answer to all of this is the more clarity around what these things are, and presumably it comes in the fashion of industry engaging with the regulators to work together on this, then actually we should be able to unlock these opportunities more quickly. Because I think, certainly something that's come on time and time again is in the same way that carbon markets might be unlocking that energy transition Gordian knot, blockchain technologies are potentially a great way of unlocking some of the challenges around trading commodities as
Yeah.
well, with greater transparency.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many use cases for blockchain technology, and it is concerning because it does get kind of looped in with the concerns around digital assets and cryptocurrency. It's almost as though you might throw the baby out with the bathwater because you don't you're concerned about the products that are being bought and sold using the technology, but yet the technology uses go far beyond that. So it is trying to find a way to do this where we're not going to stifle the innovation, we're not going to kill this technology in its infancy, that we're not going to drive it offshore and, kind of fall behind. So it is a difficult needle to thread. And what concerns me right now is it seems to be that needle is kind of being thread through enforcement actions.
The judiciary is not best equipped to be making decisions on how these markets should operate, right? As you say, you want to make sure that we're unlocking legitimate enterprise and there's clear rules, as opposed to otherwise Switzerland will become the de facto home, which it already is, because it has much more advanced regulation on this stuff for these blockchain startups and technologies, and to the detriment of the United States and other markets.
And this is an area where we really do need elected officials to act, and I think they are trying very hard. And we might see legislation kind of come together in the next year, maybe probably more likely the next Congress. But until then, it's very uncertain. It's tough, and I think again, I do think that Congress, the administration, they see it, they realize it, and they're trying.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for coming on. I think it will be a heartening listen to our community on that the CFTC is thinking about all of these challenges, and is engaging the community to be able to solve them. And hopefully we can have you back on, Summer, in the next year and see where we're landing on some of these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who's listening, feel free to reach out to my office. We have an open door policy, and the way I learn how to do my job better is to hear from folks who are in the markets day to day.
Fantastic. And I can share a link to where people can find your contact details in the show notes.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.